Welcome to Shatter.
It happened at a dinner party that wasn't supposed to matter. One of those polished, borrowed evenings where the lighting is soft, the wine is overpriced, and everyone is pretending they belong to something just slightly higher than their actual rank. We were seated at a long table in a rented loft downtown, concrete walls, exposed beams, the kind of place my wife loved because it photographed well. I remember the moment with uncomfortable clarity. A venture guy across the table had just finished talking about his latest fund, the way he always did, casual arrogance wrapped in charm. My wife leaned back, glanced at me, and smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, a small, precise smirk. Then she said it, lightly enough that everyone could hear, but no one would feel obligated to react. She wondered out loud if this was really all I had to show for myself. The words landed soft, but the meaning was sharp. Convenient. Predictable. Finished. The table laughed. Not cruelly. Politely. The way people do when they sense a hierarchy being adjusted in real time. I didn't answer. I didn't smile. I didn't correct her. I just went quiet. That silence did something. Not to her. Not yet. But to me. Something closed. Like a door that had been creaking for months finally settling into its frame. My wife, Claire, was glowing that night. She wore confidence like a tailored jacket, fed by proximity to power. She worked PR for a startup that burned money faster than it built products, but she knew how to stand near influence and look like she belonged there. I was the opposite. A cybersecurity engineer at a fintech company, paid well to stay invisible and make sure systems didn't fail. I spent my days preventing disasters no one ever noticed. On the drive home, she scrolled through her Apple iPhone, replying to messages that made her smile. I watched the city blur past the window and realized I hadn't checked my own messages once all evening. Not Slack, not LinkedIn. Nothing urgent waited for me. And that, I thought, might be the problem in her eyes. Later that night, as she slept easily beside me, I lay awake replaying the smirk, the laughter, the investor's approving nod. I understood something then. The joke hadn't been accidental. It was a signal, a public adjustment of value. And once value is adjusted in public, the only response that matters isn't defense. It's distance. The first real crack didn't come from her phone or her behavior. It came from someone who had no reason to lie to me. 2 days after the dinner, I was back at the office late, running a routine audit that had nothing to do with my job description, but everything to do with my instincts. I'd learned a long time ago that systems rarely fail where people are looking. They fail in the margins, where no one thinks to check. Around 9, I ran into Mark in the parking garage. He worked in corporate compliance, the kind of guy who spoke carefully even when ordering coffee. We weren't friends, but we shared a quiet mutual respect. He nodded toward my car, hesitated, then asked how Claire was doing. The question felt rehearsed. I told him she was busy. That was true. He paused again, longer this time, and mentioned, almost casually, that he'd seen her at a private networking event the week before. One not listed publicly. Invitation only. Investor heavy. He said she'd looked very comfortable there. Familiar, even. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. The way he avoided eye contact did the rest. On the drive home, the city felt different. Sharper. Like the contrast had been turned up without my consent. At a red light, I glanced at my Apple iPhone. No missed calls. No messages. Claire hadn't checked in once that day. At home, she was already there, barefoot in the kitchen, glass of wine in hand, telling me about a long strategy meeting that had run late. Her tone was smooth, practiced. The same tone she used in public when she wanted to sound important without inviting questions. I didn't question her. I nodded. I listened. I watched the details instead. The way she placed her phone face down on the counter. The way she avoided specifics. The way her confidence felt slightly performative, like she was repeating a line she'd already tested on a better audience. That night, I sat in my office long after she went to bed and opened LinkedIn. Not to snoop exactly, to observe. Patterns always showed themselves when you stopped rushing them. I noticed a name that had appeared more than once in her recent activity. An investor. Older. Public-facing. Someone whose approval carried weight far beyond money. I didn't feel anger. That surprised me. What I felt was alignment. Pieces sliding into place with quiet precision. This wasn't about desire. It wasn't even about betrayal in the traditional sense. It was transactional. Access traded for acceleration. Respect exchanged for leverage. And once I understood that, I knew something else too. This wasn't going to end with a confrontation. It was going to end with a recalibration. I didn't go looking for proof the way people imagine. No secret apps. No dramatic password guesses. I just stopped ignoring the systems that had quietly been shared between us for years. When you live with someone long enough, your lives overlap in small, practical ways. Cloud storage, calendar permissions, streaming accounts. None of it feels invasive until it suddenly matters. And when it does, the data doesn't shout. It whispers. The first thing I noticed was rhythm. Her calendar had gaps that didn't line up with the story she told me. Lunches that stretched too long. Strategy sessions that repeated with surgical regularity. Always midweek. Always ending just early enough for her to come home composed. I didn't confront it. I logged it mentally, the way I logged anomalies at work. Then there were the photos. Not explicit. Nothing that would satisfy a courtroom or a jealous friend. Just context clues. Reflections in glass. Familiar hands holding wine glasses I recognized from investor events. Backgrounds that didn't match the restaurants she claimed to love. The metadata was more honest than she was. One evening, while she showered, her Apple iPhone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The preview showed a name I'd already seen on LinkedIn, paired with a message that assumed proximity. Not longing. Logistics. A question about timing. That was the moment it fully clarified. This wasn't an affair built on secrecy and emotion. It was efficiency. Scheduled. Optimized. She wasn't sneaking around. She was managing access. I started moving quietly after that. Not emotionally. Operationally. I separated accounts. Changed recovery emails. Shifted permissions so shared folders became private without triggering notifications. I rerouted joint expenses to my own cards, not to punish her, but to remove dependency. Each change was small enough to go unnoticed on its own. Together, they formed distance. At dinner, she talked about momentum, about visibility, about how things were finally lining up for her. I listened and noticed how often she used "we" when referring to her career, as if my presence still contributed to her credibility. Later that night, alone in my office, I watched her LinkedIn notifications light up with likes and comments from people who had never once asked what I did. I felt no urge to correct the picture. What she didn't understand yet was this. I wasn't gathering evidence to expose her. I was mapping exits. And once an exit is mapped, the only mistake is announcing when you plan to take it. I didn't leave in a dramatic way. No suitcase by the door. No announcement. I just stopped showing up where I was expected to be. The first change was availability. I began taking calls later, replying slower, letting silence stretch just a little longer than what felt polite. When Claire asked where I'd been one evening, I told her I'd picked up a short consulting assignment tied to a security review. It was believable. I'd done it before. She nodded, already distracted by her Apple iPhone lighting up with someone else's urgency. Then I adjusted the digital perimeter. I updated my work schedule so my nights away blended into normalcy. I muted shared notifications. Location sharing quietly expired. Nothing broke. Nothing alerted. Systems don't scream when access is removed correctly. They just stop responding. The first night I didn't come home, she texted once. Casual. A check-in. I answered hours later with a neutral explanation and no emotional weight. The second night, she called. I let it ring. The third night, there were 3 calls and a message that tried to sound relaxed and failed. I watched the screen light up, then go dark again. I stayed in a short-term rental across town, the kind of place designed for people who don't want to be remembered. Clean lines. Neutral colors. No personal touches. From there, I could still see the world I'd stepped out of without being inside it. I kept an eye on her public life the way you monitor a system after changing a critical variable. LinkedIn told a story she wasn't aware she was publishing. Increased activity. More visibility. More posts about alignment and momentum. The kind of noise people make when they're trying to reassure themselves they're in control. Privately, the tone shifted. Messages grew sharper, then softer. Concern replaced confidence. Questions appeared where assumptions used to be. She wanted to know when I'd be back, whether I was okay, whether everything between us was fine. I answered just enough to keep the connection technically alive. What she didn't realize was that I hadn't disappeared. I was still present in all the places that mattered. Financially independent. Professionally intact. socially invisible by choice. I was no longer part of her daily feedback loop, no longer available to stabilize her narrative. A week in, she mentioned feeling off balance. She said something felt different. She couldn't explain it. She said it like an observation, not an accusation. I listened. I acknowledged. I didn't reassure. Distance, when applied correctly, doesn't look like abandonment. It looks like gravity quietly changing direction. I never reached out to the investor directly. That would have been clumsy, emotional, too visible. Instead, I watched the edges of his world, the same way I'd learned to watch systems that believe they were untouchable. People like him don't hide wrongdoing. They hide patterns. Overconfidence does the rest. His name showed up everywhere once I stopped filtering it out. Panel announcements, startup demo days, comment sections on LinkedIn where he spoke with authority about ethics, transparency, and long-term value. The louder the virtue, the thinner the armor usually is. I didn't dig illegally. I didn't hack. I didn't cross lines. I followed public threads and noticed where they didn't quite align. Portfolio companies with overlapping leadership. Advisory roles that blurred into influence. A nonprofit board seat that conveniently connected him to regulators he publicly criticized. None of it was explosive on its own. Together, it told a story that just needed the right reader. That reader wasn't me. I compiled nothing that looked like a dossier. No files. No trail. I simply redirected attention. A quiet nudge here. An anonymous question there, dropped into the right professional channels where people already spoke in hypotheticals. The kind of questions that don't accuse, but make everyone pause. Within days, I saw the shift. His posting cadence slowed. His tone changed. The confidence softened into defensiveness. Invitations still came, but the language around them grew more careful. Less celebratory. More conditional. Claire noticed before I said a word. She mentioned, almost offhandedly, that one of her key contacts seemed distracted lately. That meetings were being rescheduled. That momentum felt stalled. She laughed it off, but the laugh came too quickly. I stayed neutral. I asked nothing. Offered nothing. What fascinated me wasn't his discomfort. It was hers. She had built part of her stability on proximity to his certainty. As that certainty wavered, so did her footing. She checked her Apple iPhone more often now, refreshing messages that didn't arrive fast enough. Her LinkedIn posts grew sharper, more performative, as if volume could compensate for friction she didn't understand. And still, she couldn't reach me the way she used to. Not emotionally. Not logistically. I existed outside her narrative now, unavailable for reassurance or reaction. I hadn't touched her career. I'd simply removed the scaffolding she didn't realize she was leaning on. And once scaffolding starts to creak, everyone nearby hears it, even if no one knows who loosened the bolts. The shift became visible at a charity mixer Claire insisted we attend together. She framed it as optics, said it would look strange if I didn't show up after being so busy lately. I agreed without resistance. Presence, I'd learned, was sometimes more destabilizing than absence. The venue was familiar, clean, modern, designed for donors who liked to feel observed. I arrived on time. She arrived energized, already scanning the room for signals. When she introduced me, her hand lingered a second longer than necessary on my arm, a subtle attempt to reattach a symbol she felt slipping. What changed wasn't anything I did. It was what no longer happened around her. Conversations that used to orbit her stalled. People listened politely, then drifted. Eyes moved past her shoulder more often than toward it. The investor she'd once positioned herself beside arrived late, spoke briefly with a small circle, and left early. He didn't seek her out. He didn't need to. Someone made a comment nearby, not to her, not about her, but close enough to be heard. A remark about reputations being fragile in tight ecosystems. It wasn't accusatory. It was observational. The kind of sentence that lands heavier than confrontation. Claire felt it. I could see it in the way her posture adjusted, in the way her smile recalibrated itself every few minutes. She checked her Apple iPhone repeatedly, refreshing messages that didn't restore her balance. I stood beside her, present but detached, no longer buffering the room for her. Later, she tried to draw me into conversations I'd once avoided. Asked my opinion on fintech trends. Mentioned my work with a new emphasis, as if rediscovering its utility. People listened to me with interest, not because I demanded it, but because I spoke rarely and precisely. On LinkedIn the next day, photos from the event went up. She tagged herself aggressively. I wasn't tagged at all. It was a small omission, but intentional. Control attempt, not oversight. Privately, her messages grew edged with concern. She asked if something was wrong, if we were okay, if I felt distant. I responded calmly, without urgency, without explanation. What isolated her wasn't exposure. No one called her out. No one confronted her. They simply adjusted. And once a room recalibrates its attention, the person who depended on it feels the loss immediately, even if no one ever says her name. Isolation doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in through delays, unanswered messages, invitations that never quite materialize. Claire didn't tell me she felt alone. She didn't have to. Her behavior filled in the silence. She started coming home earlier, as if proximity to me might restore something she couldn't name. When she spoke, her voice carried a faint urgency, the kind that comes from speaking into rooms that no longer echo back. She asked questions she'd never bothered with before. How my work was going, what I was thinking about, whether I had plans. Each question lingered, waiting for reassurance I no longer supplied. I stayed calm, available, emotionally neutral. I was there without being reachable. She scrolled through her Apple iPhone constantly now, thumb flicking upward in a nervous rhythm. Messages were shorter, replies slower. The confidence she used to wear like armor slipped, replaced by a careful attentiveness that felt unfamiliar on her. At night, she lay awake longer. I could feel it without looking. Restlessness has a sound, a shift in breathing, a pause where sleep should be. I didn't touch her, not out of punishment, out of clarity. Physical closeness would have blurred lines I'd worked too precisely to draw. Her public life continued, but thinner. Posts still went up, but engagement dropped. She tried different tones. Inspiration, authority, casual relatability. None of it landed the way it used to. The ecosystem she depended on had adjusted its attention elsewhere, and no amount of performance could force it back. She mentioned the investor once, briefly. Said he'd been unreachable lately. Said it was probably nothing. The way she said it told me it was everything. I acknowledged it without interest. The absence of reaction unsettled her more than anger ever could have. What she didn't understand yet was that I wasn't pulling away to provoke her. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't even evaluating her choices anymore. I had already stepped into a different posture. From there, I could see her clearly. A woman accustomed to leverage discovering what it felt like when leverage expired. When access closed. When the person she assumed would always be there stopped stabilizing the ground beneath her. She moved closer. I became still. And in that stillness, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Gravity, without an anchor. The confrontation didn't arrive as a blow-up. It came quietly, the way people approach something they're afraid to name. She asked me to meet her for coffee near our place, a neutral space she once considered beneath her. I arrived on time. She was already there, sitting too straight, phone face down on the table as if it might betray her if she let it speak. Her expression carried resolve layered over unease. She didn't accuse. She didn't confess. She circled. She talked about distance, about feeling like she was losing me without understanding why. She said she missed how we used to talk, how easy things were. She said it in a way that suggested nostalgia might be persuasive. I listened. I kept my voice level. When I spoke, it was brief. Not explanations. Not defenses. Observations. I told her I'd been focused. That priorities shift. That silence sometimes means clarity, not punishment. That was when she finally tried to reach for emotion. She asked if she'd done something wrong. If there was someone else. If this was about the dinner party. The smirk. The joke. I didn't answer directly. I didn't need to. I said only that respect wasn't something I negotiated for anymore. That I noticed patterns now. That I adjusted accordingly. Her composure cracked then. Not dramatically. Subtly. A pause too long. A breath taken too shallow. She realized she wasn't speaking to someone who needed reassurance or validation. She was speaking to someone who had already stepped outside the frame she controlled. She reached for my hand. I didn't pull away. I didn't hold it either. The absence of response unsettled her more than rejection would have. She searched my face for cues and found none. Later that day, she posted on LinkedIn about resilience and alignment. The language felt louder than necessary. I didn't react. I didn't view it. I didn't like or comment. I existed beyond that loop now. That night, back at the house, she hovered near me, careful, tentative. She asked if I was staying. I said yes. I was calm, precise. She didn't understand that staying didn't mean returning. I had already exited the version of the relationship where proximity equaled access, where familiarity meant control, where I filled gaps she never acknowledged. She went to bed unsettled. I stayed awake, not because I was anxious, but because I was fully present in a position I'd chosen. And from that position, there was no argument left to win. Her collapse didn't come with tears or dramatic scenes. It arrived as erosion. The first thing to go was certainty. Decisions she used to make quickly now stalled. She asked for input she once dismissed. She hesitated before posting, before replying, before leaving the house. The confidence that had carried her through rooms thinned into something cautious and reactive. Then came the social gaps. Invitations slowed, not vanished, just delayed long enough to feel intentional. People she used to see weekly were suddenly traveling or swamped. Group chats went quiet around her comments. She still had access, technically. What she'd lost was gravity. She noticed it most at home. She'd talk about her day, then stop mid-sentence when she realized she was narrating to someone who no longer mirrored her emotions. I listened without feeding the exchange. No correction, no validation. The silence forced her to hear herself. At night, memories began surfacing for her in fragments. Not sentimentality, precision. Moments she'd once overlooked now returned with weight. Times I'd quietly handled problems she never saw. Introductions I'd made without claiming credit. Stability she'd assumed was ambient, like good lighting or reliable Wi-Fi. She brought up the dinner party once, her voice measured. She said she'd been careless, that she hadn't meant it the way it sounded, that it was a joke. I didn't dispute her intent. I simply acknowledged the effect. That was enough to make the room feel smaller. Her phone became an object of frustration instead of power. She checked it constantly, scrolling through LinkedIn, watching other people announce wins she once expected to share by proximity. She refreshed, then set it down harder than necessary. The silence after notifications stopped landing hit her hardest. She tried rebuilding through effort. More charm, more openness, more vulnerability. None of it reached me the way it used to. Not because I was closed, because I was no longer positioned to be persuaded. The investor faded from her language entirely. Not mentioned, not explained. Absence as confession. One evening, she stood in the doorway of my office and said she finally understood what she'd risked. That she saw now how much of her world had been quietly supported by things she never thanked. I didn't respond right away, not to punish her, but because recognition, when it comes too late, has a different sound. And she heard it clearly in the space I left unfilled. The ending didn't feel like an ending while it was happening. There was no single moment that announced it. Just a slow, unmistakable settling. Claire stopped trying to fix things with words. She moved differently around me now. Slower, more careful, as if the ground might shift if she stepped too hard. She no longer assumed my presence meant availability. She asked before touching, before planning, before speaking for both of us. One evening, she told me she finally understood what that dinner party had been. Not a joke, not ambition, a test. She said she'd assumed I would absorb it the way I always had, that I'd stay useful, predictable, quiet. She admitted she hadn't considered the possibility that I would simply step out of the role. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, she waited. Not for forgiveness, for a signal. I didn't give her comfort. I gave her clarity. I told her I hadn't disappeared. I told her I'd stayed exactly where I was. That what changed was my willingness to show up where I wasn't respected. I said it evenly, without heat. The truth didn't need force anymore. She nodded, not because she agreed, because she recognized there was nothing left to negotiate. After that, the house grew quieter in a different way. Not tense, honest. We coexisted without performance, without assumptions. She no longer leaned on me to stabilize her emotions or her image. I no longer filled gaps she refused to see. On LinkedIn, her activity slowed. Less noise, more restraint. The world adjusted around her at a pace she couldn't rush. She noticed. She accepted it. One night, she asked what would happen next. I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't know, because some answers lose their weight when delivered too fast. I told her the future depended on whether respect could exist without leverage. Whether presence could be earned, not assumed. Whether she could stand on her own without needing proximity to borrow weight. I didn't promise anything. I didn't threaten to leave. I simply stayed exactly where I was. And that was the moment she understood the cost of that small smirk at a dinner party. Because I hadn't taken anything from her. I'd just stopped giving her access to me. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.